When you wake up in the morning, you have this clean slate that can really demonstrate a lot of what is wrong. A lot of the potential symptoms for insulin resistance are very visible in the morning. So let's just jump right in. The first one, a little bit obvious, but very important, extreme hunger. Like you wake up and you're like, if I don't eat, I'm going to pass out. I need to eat. Now in a very simple physiological explanation, your cells are not getting fuel. Glucose is a fuel. If you're insulin resistant, the cells don't get that glucose. So then they send a signal to the brain that says, hey, I'm really hungry. So the brain just sends all alarms and says, eat, 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 especially because you've been fasted overnight. But there was a study that was published in Scientific Reports that goes deeper, really helps us understand what's happening here. And it paints a nice picture. They gave subjects intranasal insulin. So they gave them an insulin spray through the nose or a placebo. Now, when you give insulin spray via the nose, it actually can cross through the blood-brain barrier a lot more seamlessly. Okay, so then after they did this, they put them under fMRI scans. They actually looked at their brain and they found the subjects that had the intranasal insulin spray ended up having better connectivity between the prefrontal cortex region of the brain, the hippocampus, and ultimately the body. What this was demonstrating was that insulin seemed to help the communication between the cells in the brain. Now with this, less hunger came as a result because the prefrontal cortex was communicating with the hippocampus and that was able to regulate the signal so that hunger wasn't as big of a thing. So it kind of comes as like a little bit of a shock because we think insulin is bad, right? Insulin's not bad. Insulin's bad in excess. We want insulin. We'd be dead without it. But a little bit of insulin should go a long way. So in this case, what's happening is insulin is actually programming the brain properly. So when insulin crosses the blood-brain barrier and programs the brain the way it should, you have less hunger. But if you're insulin resistant, that insulin doesn't reach the proper area of the brain and you get hungry because that signal is warped. So it's pretty wild. Now, if we specifically get into the realm of sweet cravings, and this is very, very particular for women as well. It's important for men, but it definitely stands out in women. Then we get really interesting. There was a study that was published in the journal Nutrients. They took subjects that were insulin resistant and they put them on a 14% carbohydrate diet. So not quite keto, but low carb. 58% fat and 28% protein. So moderate protein, pretty high fat, and really low carb. They did this for 4 weeks. Now what they found is that this improved dietary constraint 102%. This is probably the most important thing because I don't care what diet camp you sit in, being able to constrain yourself and be able to not dive into food is probably the most important thing. So 102% improvement. An extra improvement in sweet cravings specifically, and an extra improvement in sweet cravings in women particularly. So if you wake up in the morning, you feel like you need to have a bear claw, or you need to have something sweet, or you need to have some cereal, this is like the perfect time to say, wait a minute, I need to radically change my carbohydrate intake to try to combat this. If you're insulin resistant, it is an important piece. Now, for all people, one of the things that I do think is important is that when you wake up in the morning and you're craving something sweet, usually having something salty will help pacify the sweet craving because we have what are called NST neurons in the hindbrain. So these NST neurons will actually receive somewhat of a signal from salt and actually help curb some of these sweet cravings. So what I do when I wake up, if I have cravings, I drink like an electrolyte packet that has some salt in it. It helps me kind of curb the cravings and I feel like I make decisions a little bit easier in the morning, which I think is a very important thing. I put a link down below for LMNT, which is the electrolyte I use. It has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium, plus some really, really good flavors. So that link is down below and you also get a free sample pack whenever you try it. So you get a variety pack of all the different flavors. Definitely recommend that. So that link is down below. It's drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Again, drinklmnt.com/Thomas. Just try it in the morning. Try it before you have your coffee. It really does make a difference. So the next one is really, really important. Very important. It tells you a lot. We've all had days where we wake up with greasy skin. Okay, but are you waking up repeatedly with greasy skin? Almost to a point where you're starting to even break out again as an adult. One of the things we have to look at here is a pretty large data study. There was a study that was published in Advances in Dermatology. So what this study did is it took a look at 243 people with greasy skin and even acne, and 156 control people that didn't have greasy skin or acne. Okay, and then they took a look at like their HOMA-IR, their glucose levels, things like that. And they found that the lion's share of people that had greasy skin had insulin resistance, whereas the control group had much less insulin resistance. Correlation doesn't equal causation, so we need to dive into some mechanistic stuff here, which I found totally fascinating. What was really wild about this study is that they did not find glucose levels to be correlative. Like, glucose levels didn't matter. What did matter was insulin. Why is this so important? Because it tells us that you can have high blood sugar and it's not the problem, but it's when you start getting into later stage chronic high blood glucose where you become insulin resistant where you're going to start to see this symptom. So if this symptom has arisen for you, so if you have seen this symptom arise, you know that you're into a moderate to later stage of potential insulin resistance, and you definitely need to take some action quick. The reason is that insulin and IGF both increase androgen production. Okay, androgen are the sex hormones, things like that. And it decreases what's called sex hormone binding globulins. So you have basically lots of free hormones running around. I want you to think of puberty, for example. Puberty, bunch of hormones raging, what happens? Greasy skin, acne, especially in guys, because the androgens go up, right? Makes perfect sense. Same kind of thing happening here. Insulin increases androgen production. This is good in a small amount if you're trying to build muscle, but not chronically elevated over the top amounts, right? Now, we also have to factor in that insulin and what's called IGF go hand in hand. So when insulin is elevated, they also see IGF is elevated. When IGF is elevated, in this case with insulin, we also tend to see a decrease in IGF binding protein. IGF binding protein is what IGF binds to. If there's less stuff for it to bind to, it's going to elevate like crazy. What happens here is it actually alters our skin cells. It alters our keratinocytes. So it changes what's called proliferation and apoptosis. So basically it skews the rate at which cells are growing and dying, which can therefore cause our oil glands to secrete more oil. So this greasy skin thing might seem really benign, and it is benign if it happens like once or twice. But when it starts happening every day and you're seeing a trend, please, please, please check your glucose levels, start looking at this stuff. Now, the next category with this is similar, but if you wake up and you have a puffy face, okay, this used to happen to me when I was pre-diabetic, and I didn't really think about it. You look at pictures of me, my face, I was total moon face all the time. What is going on with this? It's very interesting, and here's why. Insulin is what is called anti-natriuretic. Now, it's a complicated word. What that simply means is it encourages sort of the retention of water that is concentrated with salt. Now, why is this complicated? Well, because if you have high levels of glucose a lot of times will trigger you to excrete more urine, excrete more water. And it still happens when you're insulin resistant. But what happens is high levels of insulin cause you to retain some water that's already concentrated with sodium, and you tend to retain it right here in the face. Now, we've seen this in studies where high levels of glucose don't cause this, but when insulin is clamped, so basically they stop the release of insulin, they just let it build up, they stop sort of the elimination of it, I should say, then they find this increases. So high glucose alone doesn't cause this problem, but high glucose and high insulin cause this problem. Now, very important note, it has to be high glucose and high insulin. High insulin alone is not enough to trigger this massive resorption of sodium. But high glucose and high insulin does trigger enough. This all happens to the proximal tube of the kidney and what are called epithelial sodium channels. Okay, so these epithelial sodium channels are normally active when we consume sodium, but they become even more active when insulin is present. So one of the things you notice is that when you have high levels of insulin because you're insulin resistant, and you have a salty meal with carbs, you're gonna get more puffy than the person that is not insulin resistant. You're more sensitive to that salt and carbohydrate combination. It's not about salt on its own. It's about the combination of the salt and the carbs that you become sensitive to. And you definitely see it in the morning when you're more dehydrated and it concentrates. Okay, which leads me to the next one. ridiculously high fatigue, like you're almost waking up in the morning more tired than you went to bed. Now, if you look at a study published in the journal Metabolism, this was intriguing because they actually found if you have chronic fatigue syndrome, you are 2 times as likely to have metabolic syndrome, and probably vice versa. Now, why is this happening? When you have high levels of insulin, it actually activates what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. So you kind of increase these stress responses, HPA. Now with that, you have increases in interleukin 1, interleukin 6, but also tumor necrosis factor alpha. These are inflammatory cytokines, and these are specifically being excreted or released from the adipose tissue. So the more fat that you have on you, in combination with insulin resistance, the more profound your extreme fatigue will be, because the inflammatory response is going to block the insulin from doing its job in the first place even more. So your fatigue is more pronounced. The other piece that we look at is as you start having chronically high levels of circulating glucose, the advanced glycation end products that form as a result of glycation of sugar, basically caramelizing proteins in your tissues and your blood, this damages tissues in the brain. So these tissues in the brain no longer receive and send signals properly, leading to huge levels of fatigue. So let's just give you a quick recap. You're waking up crazy hungry, and if that's the case, have a little bit of salt. You're waking up crazy hungry, you need to be eating some protein and not be eating the carbs. If you're craving something sweet, probably reduce down to a 20% or less carbohydrate per day diet. Okay, you're waking up with greasy skin. This is a longer term issue showing that you are deeper into this potential state. Now, add these things all up together, of course. Next up, the puffiness. That means, okay, I eat carbs and salt, I get way puffy and I gain like 9 pounds. What's going on? You need to check your glucose, you need to check this out, but it's only in tandem with glucose and insulin. And lastly, you're waking up more tired than you're going to bed. Please do your due diligence on yourself and fix these things. I'll see you tomorrow.